It's cold, wet, and gray on this January day in Charleston, South Carolina. So what are we doing beginning an episode of Exploring North Carolina in Charleston? We are going to follow in the footsteps of one of North Carolina's and South Carolina's first and most important citizens, John Lawson. I had met John Lawson through my marked up and dog-eared copy of A New Voyage to Carolina, edited in the 1960s by the late Hugh Talmadge Leffler of UNC Chapel Hill. The original, published in London in 1709, contained Lawson's Journal of 1,000 Miles, traveled through several Indian nations. In researching this episode of Exploring North Carolina, we were fortunate to find 3 modern-day history sleuths who have been fans of John Lawson for over 30 years. Civil engineer Val Greene, South Carolina archaeologist Chester DePrater, and retired East Carolina University botany professor Vince Bellis. Using Lawson's Journal, old maps, and modern tools, these men have added to Hugh Leffler's work by reconstructing Lawson's route through the Carolinas in uncanny detail. Although you'll get to know our Lawson experts better in a few minutes, you might be interested to know why they believe Lawson and his book are so significant.
John Lawson has not received his just desserts for his accomplishments and his journal that he left us for this period of Carolina's history. He made a trip through the Carolinas. He described a period of time for which we have no other record, and John Lawson is the only one that has done this for us. His journey is the equivalent of the Lewis and Clark expedition 100 years later in the Midwest. It's our snapshot of cultural and natural history of the Carolinas when there were no other people here to record that, and so we have to give Lawson his due. We have to give him the same credit we've given others.
Well, we're very fortunate that John Lawson left us the account of his journey through the Southeast that he did, because it gives us a snapshot of what life in the interior was like for the Indians of the region in that period between 1700 and 1701 when he passed through the area. There are other travelers that came through in the decades right after he came through and just before he did, but their accounts are travelers' accounts, not quite so detailed about the Indians, and what he provides is really a snapshot of what he was observing in the interior in that period about the Indians and what was going on between the Indian societies. As people began moving inland from the coast in the early part of the 18th century, they would have wanted to know those things. So I think in the early 18th century, John Lawson would have been a familiar name, and today he's hardly known at all.
John Lawson had a nearly unique set of skills. First, he was a keen observer of people and of nature. His training had been in the natural sciences. He was a very skilled naturalist. He was probably not a scientist, but he was a very skilled naturalist. And he also had the self-discipline to record on a frequent basis, maybe daily, his observations in a journal. And then he had the ability later on to write in a very engaging way, to write those observations into a very engaging book entitled A New Voyage to Carolina.
There was no North and South Carolina in 1700, just Carolina. And Charleston was the first port of significance south of Virginia. Travel in the winter may have seemed odd, but remember, in the winter, there were fewer mosquitoes and other insects. Winter visibility is also better, without thick foliage. John Lawson left Charleston with Indian guides and a handful of other Europeans on December 28, 1700, and went north along the South Carolina coast to Bull's Island, where he described a tree new to him. He said that palmetto trees have leaves growing only on top of the tree, in the shape of a fan, and in a cluster, like a cabbage. On January 3, 1701, Lawson entered the Santee River by boat. From this point, he walked the rest of the way. He passed along deep swamps of cypress and tupelo. Lawson passed near this magnificent Indian mound near the present-day Santee National Wildlife Refuge on Lake Marion. In the high hills of the Santee, he passed through the present-day Poinsett State Park. Here he saw long gray moss. About the view he wrote, "The most amazing prospect I had seen since I had been in Carolina." Moving north along the Great Catawba Trading Path, he passed through the center of present-day Camden, South Carolina. North of Camden, in Kershaw County, he reached a flat stone that rose itself a half a foot above the earth and might contain a quarter acre of land. Below Charlotte, the Catawba Trading Path passed near what became the North Carolina-South Carolina state line in 1813. 2 days later, his guides took him to a now famous location. I'm at the intersection of Trade and Trine Streets in Charlotte, North Carolina. This is one of the busiest centers of commerce in the Southeast. At this very location, the Great Catawba Trading Path crossed with another ancient Indian trade route. Here in January 1701, John Lawson met with the Catawba King. Today we would call him the Chief of the Catawbas. It would be almost 70 years before the Queen City, Charlotte, was formed. From the Charlotte area, he traveled northeast to the present-day Lowe's Motor Speedway. Here he described what we know today as the extinct passenger pigeon, which he said were so numerous in these parts that you might see millions of pigeons in a flock. At this time of the year, the flocks, as they passed by, in great measure obstruct the light of day. A few days after leaving what is now Charlotte, North Carolina, John Lawson reached the banks of the Sapona River, known today as the Yadkin River. He reached Sapona Town, the land of the one-eyed king. We don't know where Sapona Town is, but we think it's near Spencer, North Carolina, on the banks of what is now High Rock Reservoir. Lawson mentioned by name Abbott's Creek, just south of present-day Lexington. Next he visited an Indian village known as Keowee Town, in the Uwharrie Mountains near the town of Denton. Lawson's route then took him along today's Highway 62 to the Eno River and the Occoneechee Village, the site of present-day Hillsboro. His route likely took him through the Duke University campus, then just south of Raleigh and on to Clayton on present-day Highway 42. Near Wilson, where he crossed Contentnia Creek, he got barbecued shad from the Indians for a deerskin. His route took him through modern-day Greenville and the East Carolina University campus. Lawson experienced winter snow the morning he woke up near present-day Pactolus. Finally, 59 days after beginning his voyage, Lawson ended up on the banks of the Pamlico River, where he was well received by Richard Smith, a large landowner living near present-day Bath, North Carolina. This map and route of Lawson represents the work of many people. Note that it is a little different from that offered by Professor Loeffler, but Exploring North Carolina was impressed by the evidence supporting it. One of its primary proponents is Val Greene. Val is a professor, civil engineer, and passionate Lawson fan. He has followed Lawson's trail from beginning to end several times and has virtually committed to memory the entire book. We met Val on the north side of Lake Marion, near Lawson's Trail, where we visited the Santee National Wildlife Refuge, part of the National Wildlife Refuge System, where South Carolina's finest example of a Mississippian period Indian mound is located. This mound is well preserved and protected under state and federal law. I asked Val how he got interested in following the 300-year-old footprints of John Lawson.
My initial interest in John Lawson came when my wife gave me a copy of the 1967 edition of A New Voyage to Carolina. But then as I began to expand from that and read more of Lawson, my curiosity grew with the amount of knowledge I gained of him. The more I knew, the more I wanted to know. So I kept it up and kept it up and kept it up. And it's turned into a 30-year expedition of following Mr. Lawson's footsteps.
I wanted to know if the many estimates of distance in Lawson's Journal were correct.
His entire trip, which he claims to have been 1,000 miles, was actually only a little over 500 miles. And to find where Lawson was, we had to then make some estimate of how to figure his actual distances, and this we did by going out and looking at the landmarks we found, look for land grants to help us determine where the Indian paths were, and talk to local people about the natural features of the countryside and how to interpret Lawson's remarks about what he was seeing. And putting these three things together is how we actually uncovered the route John Lawson followed in his journey.
Val Greene was the person to ask if some of these routes are still in use.
Many of the roads of the Carolinas are part of the original Indian trail system that Lawson traveled. And in Camden, South Carolina, the major road that goes north-south through the city is Broad Street, and that is the Great Catawba Trading Path. And then as you go into North Carolina from Charlotte to Concord, Highway 29 is the Catawba Trading Path, or the Occoneechee Path is known as up there. And then on to Hillsborough, Highway 62 is a part of the path that goes up through Alamance County. So these roads, these Indian paths became our highways.
I asked Val Greene if Lawson ever exaggerated regarding animals.
In John Lawson's journal, he of course tended to overestimate his distances that he traveled considerably. And he also tended to overestimate what he saw in terms of animals here. And he noticed that the turkeys killed by the Indian hunter that was with him might weigh as much as 40 or 50 pounds, when in fact a wild turkey can only weigh about 20 pounds or so. And then he saw a bird at the Congaree town, which he said was scarcely less than 6 feet tall and had a crimson hue on its head. And this was probably a sandhill crane, and a sandhill crane certainly is not anywhere near 6 feet tall. So while he was doing his best to give us a picture of what he was seeing, his observations did not have a good background, him being an urban boy from London. But as he went along in his trip, he saw more, he got more familiar with the landscape, and his estimates tend to come more in line with reality the further he goes along the trip.
I wanted to know from this student of Lawson what is most significant about his book and life.
John Lawson's journal left us a record of what Carolina was like 300 years ago, and today we can recognize that some of those things are missing and some of those things are still with us. He told us about the lions and the tigers and the wolves, the animals of Carolina, the buffalo, the elk, the passenger pigeon, and all these sort of things. And those things are gone, or they're extirpated from this area at least. But there are still things that are here. There are landmarks, and there are natural things, and there are cultural things, such as the Fort Watson Indian Mound behind me here, which are a part of our cultural history, and it's important that we recognize what these things are and preserve them for future generations of Carolinians.
South of Camden, South Carolina, at the Mulberry Plantation on the Wateree River, I met Chester DePratter, a distinguished research archaeologist from the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of South Carolina. I asked DePratter about Lawson's interaction with American Indians during his journey.
As Lawson traveled through the interior, he visited a number of Indian towns that he was led to by his Indian guides. He visited the Santee, for instance, and the Sewee, the Congaree, the Wateree, the Waxhaw, all of which are peoples that we know from other accounts of people who were in the interior both earlier and later. We see those communities that he visited as being probably spread out along the rivers, where there would have been a main town where the chief and perhaps some of his family lived, and then little farming hamlets up and down the river that he noticed and mentions in his account in several places.
Unfortunately, Lawson observed the effects of disease brought from Europe that ravaged native populations.
The diseases that were introduced by the Europeans that had such devastating impact on the Indians who lived in this area were things that we take for granted today. Things like chickenpox and measles, common cold, influenza, all of those kinds of diseases that would have impacted Indian societies that had no natural immunity in ways that they don't impact us today. So that when one of these epidemics swept through this area, on the low end there might have been 20, 30, 40% mortality rate from influenza or something like that, and at the high end as much as 80 or 90% of particular villages could have died off at a single time. And so when Lawson came through, he was looking at a remnant of maybe only 10% of the population in terms of total numbers that had been seen by the Spanish when they came through 150 years before.
I wanted to know why John Lawson is still important to archaeologists today.
And as an archaeologist, I'm interested in that because he saw Indian towns as he passed through the interior. And if we can pin down the route he followed based on the clues that he gives us, then ultimately we can go and look at the Waxhaw settlement or the Wateree settlement or the Congaree settlement and find those places where the Indians were living at that moment in time and excavate them. And again, combine that with his description that provides in the account and come to a better understanding of the Indian societies that were here at the turn of the 18th century.
First-time readers of Lawson must understand that he was Eurocentric. As an 18th century Englishman, he used some terms to describe American Indians, such as heathen, that we would today find demeaning or insulting. Chester de Prater and others, however, make it clear that Lawson admired and respected the Indians along his journey.
The Lawsons Journal provides us a great deal of insight into the Indians along the way and some of the varied skills they possessed. He was quite impressed with their ability to go out and hunt and bring back game to feed the entire party. He was impressed with the skills that the Indians had in curing disease or any kind of ailment with plants. So you look at those things and you think that he did have some respect for them, but you see that the way of life that they led wasn't very attractive to him in lots of ways. But he never says anything demeaning about the Indians or anything that would make you think that he didn't respect them for people and for the way they were able to make their living off the land.
I asked de Prater why Lawson's work should be considered important today.
John Lawson is an important figure in our understanding of the Southeast as it existed at the turn of the 18th century. He's a person who went into the interior at a time when there were not many others in the interior leaving us written accounts. There were other explorers that came before and after him, we know, but they just didn't write down their observations. So he's left to stand alone, really, as a descriptor of what was going on in that period in the interior Southeast.
In following Lawson's trail, many things are unchanged, but there are many things missing from today's landscape. Lawson described swans in the Piedmont. His descriptions of the extinct passenger pigeon are among the best we have. He writes about the once plentiful chestnut and describes open lands in North Carolina's central Piedmont. In one passage he writes, "We traveled this day about 25 miles over very pleasant savanna ground, high and dry, having very few trees upon it, and those standing at a great distance." He wrote about the Carolina parakeet, also now extinct. I met with our third Lawson detective on the banks of the Sapona, or Yadkin River. Vince Bellis is a retired East Carolina University botanist who knows Lawson's life in North Carolina as well as anyone.
I believe that John Lawson came to the Carolinas out of a desire for adventure and personal ambition. The adventure comes from the fact that he was only 26 years old, had probably never been out of England in his life, and he had attended classes at Gresham College. Gresham College in London was the home of the Royal Society, and a number of adventurers and explorers from around the world were giving lectures frequently at Gresham College, and he would have heard these, and I think it would have given him a desire to see those parts of the world himself.
I wanted to know more about John Lawson, the Englishman.
When John Lawson arrived in Charleston in the late fall of 1700, he made the acquaintance of Englishmen who were already there, of course, and also a group of tradesmen who'd come down from Virginia. And they agreed to take him north with them as they returned to Virginia. The entire group of probably 7 or 8 people included both Indians, Englishmen, and Virginians. The success of their journey was really totally dependent upon those Indian guides.
As a botanist and scientist, I wanted Bellis to tell me about Lawson's list making.
John Lawson provides us with lists of plants and animals and people and minerals, a whole variety of things that he saw and described in the upcountry of the Carolinas. For the most part, these are the first descriptions and lists of these things. And in many cases, it was decades before anyone else went back and took a look at the same locations. Using this list and the recent knowledge of where some of these sites actually were, we can now go back and compare Lawson's lists with what we find there today. And in many, many cases, these areas are virtually unrecognizable because of the changes that have occurred. But then also in many cases, Lawson would probably recognize the site today.
Since in some ways Lawson was a founding citizen, I wanted to know about his ties to North Carolina's first towns.
John Lawson established North Carolina's first town, Bath, in 1705. He was the surveyor that laid the town out, reserving for himself the choicest lot. Later, in 1710, while he was in England, he met the Graffenreid party and led them back to North Carolina, landing in Virginia, going overland to the Chowan River, and then by boat down to New Bern, establishing North Carolina's second town.
Shortly after his book was published in 1709, and after New Bern was founded in 1710, Lawson died. I asked Vince Bellis how it happened.
In September of 1711, John Lawson and Baron de Graffenreid traveled up the Neuse River in search of a new land route to Virginia. During that trip, they were captured by the Tuscarora Indians and held for a trial. The trial apparently had something to do with the lands that were being then taken from the Indians. In any event, de Graffenreid was released and Lawson was condemned to death.
There is no drawing or painting of Lawson about which anyone is certain, but this portrait was probably painted in London around 1708 when Lawson returned to England to publish his book. The subject is in his mid-30s, about the same age as Lawson, and he is carrying papers on which is painted Sir John Lawson. It is owned by Dean Emeritus Keats Sparrow of the Thomas Harriot College of Arts and Sciences at East Carolina University. Neither Dean Sparrow nor anyone else can be sure, but you may be looking at Mr. Lawson. Because of the importance of his work to North and South Carolina, Exploring North Carolina agrees with Val Greene that Lawson has not gotten his just rewards.
John Lawson has not received his just deserts for his accomplishments and his journal that he left us for this period of Carolina's history. His journey is the equivalent of the Lewis and Clark expedition 100 years later in the Midwest.
We hope you've enjoyed your journey following the 300-year-old footsteps of John Lawson through the Carolinas. And we hope you'll join us again soon as we and the ghost of John Lawson continue to explore